Good morning, everybody. Welcome and thanks for joining our topical webinar. My name's Lord Randall, though I really much prefer to be John today. I'm president of the Colne Valley Regional Park, a position I'm really honoured to hold. As a local resident and the former MP for the Uxbridge constituency, I'm only too familiar with the changes and pressures across the Colne Valley over the decades. This is a greenbelt area on the edge of the capital and offers the first taste of countryside for, yes, millions of people. Now, our reason for hosting this event today is because those changes and the pressures seem to us to be currently reaching unprecedented heights. We've got three speakers today, David Sutherland, Katrina Riddle and Jerry Unsworth. They'll be joined on our panel by our managing agent, Stuart Pomeroy, to take your question. Stuart leads the operations side. So, to give you a little bit of a background, the park spans the edge of 5 counties and is run by a board with representatives from the local authorities, private, community and environmental sectors. Operations are managed by a contract with Groundwork South, a charitable organisation that works very hard to improve the area for people in its natural environment. We're all immensely proud of what the Colne Valley has to offer, and I hope this event helps you understand more about its context and the issues and opportunities. We hope it helps both you and us develop a clearer picture of the way ahead. This is the first event of this type that we've hosted, and we're really grateful for the assistance we're getting from Arup, Katya on the professional logistics side and Vicky in the background on the technical side. I hope you all enjoy the session, and I shall pass you over to Katya, who will say a few words before we move to the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. My name's Katya Fox. I'm from Arup, and I'm going to be moderating the event today. Just to let you know, we are recording today's event for you to listen to again or to share with colleagues who aren't able to attend today. And we will be making available afterwards the presentations and a summary of the Q&A session at the end. There is an opportunity to ask questions throughout. There is a live chat function on the screen, which you're welcome to submit questions at any time, and we will do our very best to answer them all at the final session. Our first speaker today is David Sutherland, who is the Head of Climate Change and Environment at Buckinghamshire Council. Recently, David has been doing lots of work at developing a climate change strategy for the council, leading on a very large-scale tree planting project, which will see 500,000 trees planted on the council's land, and has been one of the 5 pilot authorities producing a local nature recovery strategy. Today, David's going to talk to us about the environmental dimensions of Greenbelt, focusing particularly on the Environment Bill, nature recovery strategies, and the role of local authorities improving Greenbelt. So over to David.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. So just as you say, a little bit more background. So yeah, since the formation of the Buckinghamshire Unitary, I suppose I've kind of managed the area which has brought together all of the environmental specialists, the ecologists, our arboriculturists, strategic flood, climate change and energy, local nature partnerships. So we've really got a kind of grouping of, I suppose, environmental specialists in terms of that ability to kind of manage and deliver solutions for the environment. So in terms of the actual kind of presentation I'm going to go into, I'm hoping this is a bit of a scene setter in terms of how national environment policy is changing. Its kind of impact on land management, the role of local authorities, the opportunities that's going to present in terms of that kind of environmental policy, and how it importantly kind of ties into planning, because there's a really important kind of link in terms of that kind of tying to planning. So that's what I'm kind of aiming to cover in the kind of next 15-20 minutes. Next, please. So if I look at, I suppose, emerging national policy, so we're very well aware of the kind of the climate change kind of crisis, and obviously the government has put into legislation its commitment to net zero emissions. I think more subsequently, we've become equally aware of the I suppose the issue regarding biodiversity loss, and I suppose in terms of how important that is and the functioning of our ecosystems and nature. and an understanding of, I suppose, of all that they provide for us, whether that be kind of water, carbon capture, flood protection. And a couple of years ago, the government published its 25-year environment plan, which kind of put that understanding or placing value on the environment, not just for its intrinsic value, but for all those things it provides us, i.e. clean water, storing carbon, flood protection, and all those things that hadn't necessarily been taken into account in decision making. It's trying to embed that into kind of future policy. And I think as we're seeing kind of policy emerge, we're seeing that come through. The bit I want to concentrate today is the Environment Bill, and two particular aspects of that. So the government, this is now kind of moving through Parliament as we speak, and there's two aspects of that I want to focus on. Firstly, biodiversity net gain, but also local nature recovery strategies. And more recently, the government's also published its England Tree Strategy, which sets out its ambitions in respect of from street trees all the way through to kind of large-scale tree planting. And the other bit I do want to focus on, because it's related in terms of land management, is the Agricultural Bill, which again reflects the kind of the shift away in terms of land management as we move out of the Common Agricultural Policy to much more of a system focused on payments for kind of environmental land management. So I'm just going to kind of touch on as a bit of a scene setter. Next, please. So starting with biodiversity net gain. So, we're well aware of the scale of biodiversity loss in terms of not just this country, but a kind of across the globe, and 40% of UK species in decline. And I think only recently it was announced we're kind of the most nature depleted G7 country, which is a staggering fact. And, in Buckinghamshire, we've kind of seen that loss of species as well. And so I think, the government recognised, fundamental change was required in terms of how we redress that. And so the Environment Bill introduces a requirement that all development must deliver a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. So that kind of recognises, at the heart of our ability to thrive and survive, we need our ecosystems to be functioning and playing that kind of critical role that they do in terms of, adapting to climate change, flood alleviation, public health. And so that, all development must deliver 10% net gain. And interestingly, an amendment to the Environment Bill, I think a couple of weeks ago, now incorporating nationally important infrastructure as well to deliver that biodiversity net gain as well. And just to be clear, this is not to supplement nor to replace, existing protected sites or habitat. This is about, us following the mitigation hierarchy in terms of providing on-site, so getting developers to build this in on-site at the very start of the process, and only at the very kind of end, if on-site can't be delivered, do we then look at where off-site, I suppose, is relevant. And that kind of plays out into the kind of the next big key policy ask in terms of, well, where would that go? From Buckinghamshire's perspective, we're looking to get ahead of the game on this one. We consulted on a biodiversity net gain supplementary planning document in terms of how a local scheme would be rolled out, and I know our local nature partnership has been absolutely fundamental to help us work that through, and how we go about delivering that. But I think the key to this is, if this works, then great. But where would those financial payments go in terms of where would we create new habitat or restore new habitat, which is where it kind of comes on to the next policy. Next, please. So the next big key kind of policy in the Environment Bill is the requirement to produce, or for local authorities to produce, local nature recovery strategies. And when I say local authorities, this is kind of like upper tier authorities, so either counties or unitaries. And this is a kind of a really flagship measure in the Environment Bill. So it's a new system in terms of strategic planning tool for nature. The idea is that this will cover the whole of England. These strategies will cover the whole of England to form a nature recovery network. So you have a national network of wildlife-rich places that both benefit wildlife and people. It's about expanding, improving, connecting, all those kind of keywords, and about addressing biodiversity loss, climate change, and public well-being. And at the heart of this is about agreeing local priorities for nature's recovery. But importantly, it's about mapping specific proposals where action for nature's recovery should happen, not just for nature, but how we can kind of deliver wider environmental goals in respect of kind of climate change, improving health and well-being, managing flood risk, so on and so forth. And behind this, there's some big commitments. you know, it's talked about restoring 75% of protected sites to favourable condition, creating 500,000 hectares of new habitat outside of protected sites, you know, increasing woodland cover, 30,000 hectares per year in terms of planting, you know, more diverse and better connected habitats, and a commitment to enhance access to green space. So there's some big policy commitments that sit behind this. And just in terms of, next slide, please, in terms of how they're intended to be used. And this is, I suppose, the interesting thing. So whilst, you know, the guidance we've had to date is that the measures that are set out in local nature recovery strategies are not binding, it is about presenting opportunities, and opportunities, I suppose, that can be picked up in a number of respects. So in terms of, as a strategic planning tool, how can this help inform decisions under local plans in terms of opportunities, you know, landscape management plans, green infrastructure plans, but also, I think, really importantly, the government are seeing these as a way to guiding decisions on various funding streams. So I've already talked about biodiversity net gain in terms of where we might create habitat under biodiversity net gain. I'll come on to talk about the kind of the new environment land management scheme, and there's a significant chunk of funding out of that. But also, you know, the government's recently announced a 500 million woodland creation grant scheme. And I think, you know, they're seeing local nature recovery strategies helping guide where that finance for is due to go, kind of both locally in terms of kind of creating habitats and kind of nature's recovery. So potentially a really powerful tool, and also, as you say, to help planning authorities understand locations for conserving and enhancing biodiversity. So that's kind of how they're intended to be used. Next, please. So, as mentioned at the start, Buckinghamshire was lucky to be one of 5 pilots to test these. So, yeah, we're kind of, as this is kind of going through Parliament, the government is going to produce regulations for authorities to follow, and we were one of 5 pilots to test the process for producing these. And there were different geographies and, I suppose, authorities around the countries that tested this. And yeah, we were effectively stress testing a process. But I think what I would stress is that in terms of the context of the Colne Valley, clearly, if local authorities are producing these, there has to be dialogue going on between them in terms of how these are connecting up. And so 2 of the pilots were joining, I think, to help understand how that process would work. And the shared learning from these pilots will help inform the national regs and guidance, which is due out later in the summer. Clearly, collaboration is the key to these. You know, we've had a pilot area team that's focused. You know, we've had the Local Nature Partnership, we've had Natural England, the Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, our local wildlife trust, at the core of driving this locally. And, you know, that collaboration is key. Some of you might have been on some of the workshops and the webinar that we ran in respect of whilst we were kind of pulling this together. But that's in terms of, you know, who's involved, and we've produced a kind of a template product, which I'll come on to very briefly. But, you know, we've come up with 50 prioritised actions and outcomes in terms of what we think are the outcomes for nature's recovery at a local level, and a map in terms of what we think that might look like. The next slide, please. So in terms of what they will contain, I suppose 2 things: a statement of biodiversity priorities and a local habitats map. The first effectively setting out our as is, i.e. where all our kind of protected sites, our SSSIs, our wildlife sites, all the things that are protected. But it also then sets out where we think the potential measures for delivering our priorities should happen, as it were. And that's then translated on the local habitats map. So that kind of sets out all of our, you know, where our SSSIs are, where of our local nature, you know, wildlife sites are, but almost importantly, where are the proposed locations that we're going to deliver solutions that deliver, I suppose, yeah, nature's recovery, that delivers wider benefits. So that's the 2 things that we will deliver as local authorities. Next slide, please. And then, I suppose, importantly, it's not all about nature. This is about, I think, you know, delivering wider multiple environmental benefits. How can we deliver through these kind of interventions actions that deliver kind of climate change mitigation through habitat restoration? How do we deliver, you know, natural flood management? How do we deliver improved kind of public access? So I think, you know, we've been asked to think about all those things as we've pulled this together. Next, please. And just as a reminder in terms of how this kind of fits together. So yes, we've got the local nature recovery strategy pilot. We have how it fits in with all of our existing policies and plans, as well as our kind of stakeholder feedback. But under sitting that is a whole series of baseline data which we've pulled together, which part of the exercise that we've had to go through. And I will come on to that just very briefly in terms of the next slide, please. So part of the process is kind of pulling together all of the environmental baseline data. And this is a kind of a natural capital, I suppose, mapping exercise we did, which kind of looks at all of our baseline data in terms of broad habitats down to kind of a field level. And this is just kind of one map of many which we've done. And there was a series of other maps which also looked at what those habitats deliver in respect of services and benefits, i.e. where they, you know, how much carbon they sequester, the role they play in kind of alleviating floods. There's a whole set of detailed information that we've got to help inform decision making, not just in terms of where, I suppose, habitat could be created, but the role it then plays in terms of delivering those kind of wider environmental benefits. So I think that's just, you know, a picture of all the data that we've kind of pulled together. Next slide, please. So what might a map look like in terms of under a local nature recovery strategy? So the pilots have done this differently. You know, you could look at it per habitat to say, look, okay, if we're looking to create more woodland, where would we do that? And you know, we then know where existing woodland is and where we then might be looking to kind of identify kind of buffer zones in terms of that. So that's kind of at a very basic level what you could do. But if you then take that to the next level, next slide, please, you could then look to say, okay, well, we know where all our existing kind of features and habitats are. If we're then looking to deliver multiple benefits in terms of, you know, carbon sequestration, flood protection, increased public access, improvements in air quality, where are those locations best located? And what this, I suppose, map was showing is in terms of, you know, the more red an area is, the more benefits you're going to get by kind of creating kind of natural solutions in that area. So you can help them target more kind of informed decisions that way. Next slide, please. And then another option that I suppose that the pilot's been looking at is you've then got much more of a defined network. You could have your kind of protected sites, your nature's reserves at the core. You could then have another area which is your kind of maintain and enhanced zone. And then I suppose the interesting part is you're restoring and recovery, which is the blue on this map. Where would you look to kind of invest that made sense from a kind of connectivity point of view, from a habitat point of view, to kind of, you know, so you then have a kind of connected network. So that's kind of an option we've been exploring as well in terms of how you might go doing that. And this is scalable in terms of how much or how big a network that you would want to achieve in terms of that kind of scale of ambition. So that's just some options we've been looking at. Next slide, please. Just in terms of the kind of coming back to the links to the planning system. So, you know, the guidance we've had to date is that this is crucial in terms of the link to the planning system. You know, we know that, but I still think there's further clarity required. You know, the planning white paper is a bit, you know, vague on the kind of the links between this, and I think it could be really firmed up in terms of how, you know, this is kind of placed at the heart of the kind of the planning policy framework. Clearly it can help at its basic level to inform strategic planning decisions in terms of the new kind of local plans, and it's a great evidence base, and clearly you know, in terms of informing funding decisions, you know, it's going to be absolutely crucial. But we're not entirely sure of the planning weight in respect to local nature recovery strategies. You know, that's things we're awaiting, you know, I think on the guidance, and we fed that back as part of the learning exercise of the pilots. Next slide, please. So just turning briefly to kind of my last bit of my kind of section, I kind of mentioned at the start, I suppose, another key policy change, and this is the agricultural bill, but it does need to be kind of considered in terms of how, I suppose, the kind of the wider environment policy is changed with respect to land management. So as we've moved out of the kind of common agricultural policy, the agricultural bill is effectively replacing that kind of scheme of direct payments for farmers and land management to a new environmental land management scheme, where it's paying or incentivizing farmers and land managers and rewarding them for effectively producing public goods, i.e. the practices in land management that deliver, you know, thriving wildlife, better air and water quality. So all those things I've kind of listed there. So it's a fundamental change in terms of how land management is being financed. Next slide, please. And in terms of how this kind of relates to kind of what I've been, I suppose, talking about before. So it's going to operate on 3 tiers effectively. So at a very simple level, you have tier 1, which is kind of incentivizing farmers and land managers in respect of how they manage their hedgerows, management of soils. So those kind of simple actions. But I suppose the interesting bit where it kind of then relates more to, you know, the local nature recovery strategies is the tier 2 and the tier 3, which is the kind of the middle column and the final column, which directly relates payments under the Environment Land Management Scheme to kind of local nature recovery and local nature recovery strategies. And, you know, in the last column, in terms of, you know, these larger scale tree planting, restoring landscapes. So I think there's a real fundamental link here between, you know, that policy shift in terms of land management and the payments and what we're trying to achieve kind of elsewhere in terms of land management. So I think it just needs to be kind of taken into account in terms of how land is being managed and the payment, the financing mechanisms. And certainly the government's indication is that, you know, 70% of farmers, land managers are expected to take part in this by 2028, which is really high. So just to kind of finalise, and I'm hoping I've stuck to time. So my last slide, please. So just as a conclusion, so it's really clear that, you know, in terms of the policy that's working its way through Parliament, there's a real significant strengthening and introduction of new policies to restore nature, but also to deliver wider environmental benefits. This is not just about restoring nature. This is about kind of how we deliver kind of multiple benefits in terms of flood, improved access, so on and so forth. And 2 of those, biodiversity net gain, local nature recovery strategies, are clearly linked to planning and planning delivery, and that's going to be absolutely fundamental. You know, local authorities are required to deliver biodiversity net gain schemes, and the higher tier authorities will be required to deliver these local nature recovery strategies. And that will be a key source to channel sources of funding. And the final point I will make is that obviously as part of the Environment Bill as well, that you know, there will be an enhanced duty on local authorities to conserve and enhance biodiversity as part of all their functions and policies. So, you know, yes, we have a, you know, environment part, but I suppose all of our policies and functions, we're required to think about conserving and enhancing biodiversity. So I hope that has given a bit of a scene setter in terms of, you know, where, you know, government thinking is going in terms of wider environment policy, in terms of, and how that then kind of fits into kind of the discussion that we're talking about today. So I shall leave it there, but I hope that gives the scene setter that you were after.
That's great. Thanks very much, David, for that introductory presentation, which has given us lots to think about and to talk about later. I'd like to now introduce Catriona Riddle, who, as an independent consultant, provides support, strategic and planning, spatial planning for local authorities, and has recently authored a report on the benefits of strategic planning. Today, she's going to talk to us about the sub-regional and national planning context for green belts, particularly focusing on recent pressures and planning reform.
Thanks, Katia, and thanks, David, for a really interesting introductory presentation, and sort of just reminds us of the value of doing strategic planning properly, where we can integrate all that you've been talking about and with all the other things we have to consider when planning. Next slide, please, Katia. So I'm just going to do a little bit of history around specifically around the Metropolitan Greenbelt, and I suspect a lot of you are very aware of these, but you know, we've lost a lot of this in the last 10 years. We've sort of forgotten the roots of Greenbelt a little bit, and I think it's important that we remind ourselves where it came from, what it was supposed to do, and how it was supposed to be used, because I think a lot of the debate at the moment around Greenbelt misunderstands what Greenbelt policy is and misapplies Greenbelt policy, and I think if we're going to review Greenbelt policy, as there has been a call for, then we need to make sure that it still does what it was originally supposed to do. You know, Greenbelt was and is supposed to be a strategic planning tool. It is supposed to operate at a larger geography, and it was also supposed to be part of a two-prong approach. So where you restrained growth because of the Greenbelt for good reasons, you also compensated that with making sure that there was growth allocated across a strategic area to make sure that your needs were being mopped up one way or the other. And I think the lack of strategic planning in the last 10 years and the limited opportunity to do that, we've lost the opportunity to also make sure that that two-part policy is applied properly. More importantly, and I think this is really important, is that we had a function firstly through structural plans, but then laterally through regional strategies to actually set the general extent of Greenbelt. So there was a lot of testing around growth strategies to look at where Greenbelt remains important from a strategic perspective, but also equally where local plan reviews were needed, so more detailed boundary reviews were needed to allow for growth. And I've just put up the policy SP5 from the old South East Plan regional strategy, and you'll see quite clearly there that it's basically saying, the Greenbelt still does perform its function across the South East, but we do need to release some Greenbelt around some areas to allow for growth. But it is done within that context of making sure that the spatial strategy is sustainable and it's been done in the right way. Both Surrey Structure Plan and South East Plan, and I'll talk about Surrey Structure Plan because that's what I'm familiar with, but I suspect it was equally the same for Buckinghamshire Structure Plan and any sort of structure plan around London, that there was a general presumption that the Greenbelt within the sort of generally within the Greenbelt, the M25 ring was the most under pressure and was the most fragmented. And I think if you look at a map of the Greenbelt now, that shows that in the last 10 years that's even more so, where you end up with a large number of relatively small sites, but they are still performing extremely important functions, Greenbelt functions, separating communities and importantly separating London from the home counties, which was one of the main reasons why the Greenbelt was set up in the first place. But also that really important function of providing that green lung for London, which is something I think we often forget. So that's a little bit of history, and that still stands. It's not historical, it is still very much relevant. Next slide, please. I've just put up, this is the key diagram from the South East Plan, and that shows quite clearly, the extent of the Greenbelt, but it also shows you where Greenbelt needs to be reviewed across the South East to allow for that growth strategy. Okay, next slide, please. So how have we got to where we are in the last 10 years and what are some of the challenges? The approach to Greenbelt is set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it still contains the 5 purposes of Greenbelt, which have been developed over the last few decades. But fundamentally, these are now managed, and any changes to these boundaries are managed through the local plan process because we don't have any strategic planning system other than the duty to cooperate, or in some other cases we have combined authority spatial development strategies, but interestingly they're not allowed to change the boundaries of Greenbelt, which is one of the reasons for those following the Greater Manchester debate. That is a big local plan and not a spatial development strategy, because they did need to change Greenbelt boundaries to allow for their sort of growth strategy. So that's where we are at the moment. The general extent should endure unless the local planning authority determines that there are exceptional circumstances for releasing Greenbelt. Now, we know from the recent Guildford High Court challenge on the local plan, and the judge was very clear that exceptional circumstances are a matter of planning judgment, but they can only be determined by the decision maker, which is in the local plan's case, local planning authority, and they must go through a robust cost benefit analysis. But the factors that they take into account, the judgments they make and the weight given to these judgments are a matter for the local planning authority. So, for example, if a local planning authority goes into an examination process and has deemed that there are no exceptional circumstances for Greenbelt, we know that from the Reigate experience in 2014, an inspector can't then dictate exceptional circumstances, and interestingly, neither can any of the objectors. So exceptional circumstances are only for the local planning authority. And in the NPPF, there is a very clear case that if the local planning authority decides that the costs for releasing Greenbelt would outweigh the benefits, then that is a decision that they are able to make. We haven't as yet seen a local planning authority go forward with a local plan under the standard methodology that challenges that and actually says we're not going to meet our needs because the exceptional circumstances don't exist. But I suspect, as we're going to see a lot more southeast local planning authorities on the edge of London coming through, that we may well see that argument playing out a little bit more in examination. And of course, additional changes can be made through the the planning application stage, where they have to demonstrate very special circumstances, but that is generally a harder bar to cross than exceptional circumstances through the local plan. And I've put there because I think it's quite important that the Cornerstone barristers sort of summary of that decision, the Guildford Challenge. But if you've got time, it's a long report, but if you've got time and you are interested, then I urge you to read it, because there is an awful lot of learning, I think, in just that one decision. Next, please. So what are the key issues? There are, when I do any work anywhere, the first thing I do is go onto Twitter and look at all the campaigns that are up against me in that area. And we've got, this is the London Greenbelt Council's very useful map, but there are other maps now from campaign groups that sort of just map out all the various campaigns, because I think it has become, in the last 10 years, Greenbelt has always been high profile issue, it's always been contentious, there's always been a lot of debate about it, but I think in the last 10 years we've seen a lot more of that, and a lot more of people understanding what Greenbelt actually is, and spending the time to understand it, so that when they go into combat, shall we say, they've got all the information that they need. But I think the biggest issue we have is that the duty to cooperate simply doesn't work in terms of strategic planning and for strategic tools like Greenbelt. If you're a local planning authority right on the edge of London and you're 70+% Greenbelt, pretty much everyone that you're surrounded by is going to be in the same boat. So how far out do you go before you actually get a neighbour to help you out meeting your needs? So unless we get a good strategic planning tool back through the planning reforms, then we're going to be in the same boat. We're going to have every local planning authority around London and across Colne Valley and places like that having to do their own local plan review, and each of them releasing Greenbelt. And that fragmentation will continue to get worse, there's no doubt about it. So we need to move away from planning by numbers, and we need to start developing local plans back again in terms of their visions, and testing the role of Greenbelt within that vision, and that cost benefit analysis within that vision as well. And generally that area within the M25 is continuously more vulnerable, and it is still more fragmented. There are arguments from many that it's unsustainable to keep jumping over the Greenbelt, but I think for a lot of people actually it's more sustainable for more people to move out to more affordable areas and travel into London by train than it is to continuously put more housing on the edge of London, where the chances are they will be moving around by car. So I think there's arguments, pros and cons on both in terms of that sustainability argument, but generally the pressure is still within that sort of M25 area, and we have got a very fragmented Greenbelt around that area, which continues to be significant in terms of its wider metropolitan Greenbelt role, but is treated for many as more vulnerable, as less Greenbelt or weakly performing Greenbelt, I think the phrase is, and therefore more subject to development pressures. So what we need to do, and I think that interested in terms of what David was talking about in terms of that wider approach to biodiversity net gain and by the sort of environmental improvements. And one of the things that I often say to members and quite often planners is that, the Greenbelt is a policy tool. You have to look at that first and foremost around the functions of Greenbelt, but that doesn't mean that you then ignore all the other arguments around improving it. And I think our COVID experience has quite a big impact on our approach and our value given to green spaces. Climate change is obviously a huge challenge. So how do we factor these in? And we're seeing multifunctional policies coming through, for example, the London plan. But we used to have what's called I think it's the Green Arc, and I think it still exists in some form around the north half of London. But that basically said, once you've done a Greenbelt review, if there are bits of scrappy Greenbelt or small areas of Greenbelt that aren't very accessible, then the fact that they are to remain Greenbelt and not challengeable means that there should be opportunities to actually improve them and improve accessibility. So for me, I think it's about getting back to that sort of approach, saying once you've done that strategic review of Greenbelt, then you do all the things that David was just talking about around improving what we've got, improving accessibility, using these green spaces for wider benefits around health and well-being, tackling climate change. And Greenbelt, I think if anybody says it's not relevant now, in terms of climate change, that sort of compact urban living, a lot of talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, they all rely on constraints around growth. They all rely on constraints provided by Greenbelt to ensure that we don't keep going out. And that doesn't mean a whole load of tower blocks, as I keep getting told. Higher density does not mean that it has to look bad. It just means it has to perform better. And I'm going to leave it there because I think there's probably enough food for thought in that presentation. Thank you very much. Oh, no, I forgot. Sorry, back, Katia. I apologise. I forgot. I'm going to talk a little bit about planning reform. And this is probably the most important slide there, because one of the things we've seen over the last couple of weeks is the Christopher Pincher, the planning minister's statement around Greenbelt. And it's an interesting one because he says quite clearly what I've just been talking about in the context of the NPPF around the fact that, you know, there is flexibility in the NPPF to protect Greenbelt, but we need to apply it better. But again, that does rely on us doing it properly and doing it at a strategic level. So I think, as Katia said at the beginning, I've been very much involved in trying to push the government in terms of its planning reforms to look at a more robust approach to strategic planning, so that we can properly integrate sort of long-term spatial priorities with infrastructure priorities, economic priorities, and the environmental priorities. And I think we don't know what's going to be said around that. We're hoping to see what comes out from the government's formal response to the consultation within a matter of weeks, I believe. It's supposed to be before the summer recess, but we'll see there. Housing numbers are going to be, at the moment, according to the government, are going to be set at a national level. But again, we don't know how things like Greenbelt are going to be taken into account. We don't know how that will be informed locally. So still some big question marks there around what happens if that follows through, although there is significant pressure, I think, politically to drop that part of the government's proposals. The government has stated very clearly that it continues to be committed to Greenbelt, and they've said there's no intention to review Greenbelt policy. But we know places like London are under extreme pressure, and the government's new policy that is expecting a large number of the cities across England to deliver 35% more than their needs, so more above what the standard methodology is saying, and that's usually already quite high. And although they're supposed to consume their own smoke, personally I can't see London doing that. London is struggling to consume its own smoke now, but if it's got to do 35% more above that, then that has to have an impact on the home counties, and that has to have an impact in the long term around how we manage the metropolitan Greenbelt around it. But the impact of COVID and climate change, you know, it has really driven that accessibility issue, that issue around having the green lungs of London again, remembering why the Greenbelt was set up in the first place, and given that real priority to maximising the benefit of any green space, whether it's around absorbing poor air quality, whether it's about health and well-being and accessibility around leisure, whether it is about just planting trees and addressing some of the challenges around climate change. we need to move to a situation where Greenbelt isn't just about policy, it is much more about that multifunctional approach. And perhaps what David was outlining in terms of the Environment Bill is what's going to take priority, but it has to be set within that statutory local plan context to give it that priority. I'm not convinced personally that DEFRA, MHCLG and the various departments that are pushing these various things are that joined up. So perhaps we need an interdepartmental approach to strategic planning that does actually tick off all these boxes and make sure we genuinely have an effective approach to Greenbelt in the long term, and it is a policy that helps manage growth in a sustainable way, and it's not all about stopping anything happening. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Catriona, for that sort of summary of the strategic case for Greenbelt and the need to think about it in the sort of a bigger picture sense. Our last presentation today is from Jerry Unsworth, who has a background in working for local authorities and since becoming an independent consultant has been working on a sort of mixture of projects from development proposals, garden town expansion, mitigation strategies related to HS2 and Heathrow's third runway proposal, as well as providing planning support for the Colne Valley Regional Park. Jerry today is going to talk to us about the sort of development pressures and the responses within the regional park and consider the aspirations for the area in the context of forthcoming planning reform. Over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Katya, and thank you, Catriona. I must say, I think, Catriona, you covered some really important issues that go to the heart of planning, but significantly, I think that they're issues that the planning white paper ducked. So I think having this conversation now is very timely, and there's always hope when final decisions haven't been made. So next, please. Yeah, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Colne Valley Regional Park. It's an large area of countryside right on the western edge of London, characterised by its rivers, water bodies and green spaces with some real gems in there. It stretches from Rickmansworth in the north to the Thames in the south and the Staines. And it's there to offer a natural environment for millions of people to enjoy and for biodiversity to thrive. I'll be covering the picture of development across the park. I'll offer some observations on the application of planning policy, and I'll conclude with my view and hopes for the upcoming planning reforms. I'd say at the outset that whilst I do some work for the Colne Valley Park, what I say will reflect my own views. Next. Thank you. The overall pattern of villages and settlements was very similar to today when the park was founded in 1965. But there was no M25, no M40, and only really an emerging M4. The rural scene across the park, urban influences and traffic will have been very different then, though inevitably these urban factors were still, relatively speaking, more significant here than in more distant rural areas. Next, please. Jump forward. Sorry. No. Yeah. So I've jumped a slide too early. I think that's not your fault, Katya, or whoever's doing the slides. Anyway, as you can see here on this map, looking a little more closely, we see the Colne Valley settlement pattern much the same, and the absence of the motorways, and what sort of influences that brings. Next, please. So jumping forward to about a decade ago, we see that the settlement pattern and urban extent across the valley remained essentially as it was in the 1960s. However, the motorways had arrived big time. But otherwise, Greenbelt policy remained essentially as it was. It continued to bite. Creeping urbanisation was resisted. And you can see on this slide in the brighter green, the park area with its greenbelt, and in lighter green, the other areas of greenbelt, including the metropolitan open land designation within London. With the pressures and changes to come, it was crying out for the interventions and management that the Colne Valley Regional Park was established to offer. Next, please. Moving forward to today, the significant changes we see are some site releases in the north of the park, south of Rickmansworth, the large expansion in the middle of the slide at Pinewood Studios after planning appeals, and the advent of HS2 with its massive areas for construction and remodelling. The construction there is not like your ordinary building site, and it will go on for around 15 years, more than the entire formative years of a child. These changes are significant and have an urbanising effect on the landscape. For instance, close up, Pinewood expansion is a big change, right next to Black Park, but I never expected to see it from the M25. Next slide, please. And next slide. Yes, these are the Pinewood buildings that gained permission under very special circumstances. And here we see HS2, a lovely part of the Colne Valley, will be crossed by what will be the longest viaduct in the UK. The construction areas are simply ginormous, with many industrial estates that will be here for years, although it's not so many as you can see. Whilst that estate may not last forever, the railway line, embankments, gantries, structures and buildings will, along with the viaduct, of course. Before I leave this slide, I ask you to memorise the green fields at the top of the right-hand picture. I shall now turn to the application of national policy. Next, please. The 2012 NPPF, as you've heard from Catriona, followed the demise of regional spatial planning. Greenbelts continued to be shown on local authorities' plans, but with the elephant in the room being development needs and very special or exceptional circumstances. The NPPF says that the fundamental aim of Greenbelt policy is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. Well, it does appear to me that for many operating the system, it's greenwash on a map with hurdles to jump. NPPF paragraph 141, the first quote in green on my slide, is very close wording to the Park's 6 objectives, promoting enhancement, access, outdoor recreation and biodiversity. To my mind, these aspects get insufficient attention amidst the very special or exceptional circumstances. The odds are really stacked against the inner Greenbelt, as there's no larger scale planning to deflect or strategically plan for the inevitable pressures that build up on the edge of the capital. One aspect of the NPPF that irks me is paragraph 138, also quoted in green. This calls for compensatory improvements to the remaining Greenbelt when sites are released. But the NPPF is not clear how to apply this when large proposals come forward outside of local plans. Housing targets for authorities in the valley using the government formula can result in huge jumps in what is planned for. Three Rivers is a current case in point. So I ask, where is the spatial strategy across the inner Greenbelt? Next slide, please. I'm afraid that strategy as a formal plan doesn't exist. But with Arup's assistance and many local authorities on board, We published this green infrastructure strategy for the Colne and Crane valleys in 2019 to highlight some ways to enhance the natural environment and people's enjoyment of it. To my mind, key to that enjoyment is excellent connectivity on foot and by bicycle. There are some great ideas and projects in the strategy, but they are seeds that need to be sown, need to be grown. Negotiating many of the roads and paths across the valley involves taking your life into your own hands. There is really so much to be done to improve routes and green corridors and join them up. The gauntlet has been thrown down, and in the present regime, it is for the local authorities to collaborate, to look within and beyond their borders to make things happen. So what might the future hold? Next slide, please. This is the same slide I showed earlier, the now position, but there is a lot on the horizon with many live applications and plans. Next slide, please. This slide adds in sites that have been put forward by the councils in their plans. In the north, the many sites in the current Three Rivers consultation, think back to those green fields I highlighted just north of HS2, huge chunks would go, and more. In Buckinghamshire, large developments were proposed in the 2019 South Bucks and Chiltern local plan, which started its examination but halted. Next down is the proposed large-scale northern expansion of Slough. And further south, albeit smaller, sites for release as part of the Windsor and Maidenhead plans. You can start to see here the cumulative scale of incursion by urban development into the park and its greenbelt if all of this goes ahead. And we've got to remember that each of these elements are brought forward not in a coordinated way, but in their individual pockets. And I've got to say, this doesn't even show the many gravel extraction sites, supposedly temporary, but which often end up opening to something permanent. Next slide, please. And there's more. This slide adds in some of the proposed infrastructure projects. Heathrow's third runway, not ruled out after the Court of Appeal just 7 months ago. And also 2 live applications for motorway service areas at Ivor Heath and the Chalfonts, and Western and Southern Rail. Next slide, please. So I ask, is this where the Colne Valley Park and the Greenbelt should go? Is it what the government wants and intended? It really feels like it is time to take stock of the future of the park and its Greenbelt. As I've said before, I think it's very dangerous looking at each project or authority plan in isolation. Somebody has got to take the overview. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, in that 7 years that I've been associated with the Colne Valley, beginning with the planning stages of HS2 and moving on to Heathrow's third runway, I've seen the great work the park is doing to try and improve the area and get people enjoying it and understanding the environment around them. To my mind, this is exactly what the Green Belt is for and what really matters. Next slide, please. But the park is battling against so much to ensure that its environment fulfills its role and potential. Things like unauthorised uses getting established by stealth, poor design of so-called mitigation schemes, flagrant disregard for rights of way, litter, dumping, and at a general level, stockpiling of land with hope value, and in some cases what appears deliberate dereliction. And when you think back to that slide showing the extent of potential development, I think you can understand why developers create that hope value. Wherever we are based, we probably think we are facing the effects of development pressure, but in the Colne Valley, it feels different. There should be intervention and management at scale to bring the best out of the area and get a grip on things. I see this as a strategic issue and one that goes to the heart of why the Greenbelt and the regional park were established. So is there hope in the planning reforms coming up? I've not seen it yet, but it's not too late. Next slide, please. Planning is certainly in the news, and these headlines are very recent, just the last few months. I get the need for development. I've spent a career looking to meet those needs whilst caring for the environment around us. This episode, though, feels different, and it's critical we get the upcoming changes right. One thing that I'm convinced about, if places like the Colne Valley Park are to be cherished, is that they need strategic support and strategic planning. I shall conclude with a few headlines on what I hope for. Next slide, please. There's got to be a strong vision and a coherent vision, one that sets up the Greenbelt as a multifunctional natural resource, much as Catriona was outlining and David gave us indicators to in his presentation. The idea of wild belts is a good one in the right places, but where the natural environment is so important to people's physical and mental health, we need to think multifunctional. At a techie level, we need to see changes to the national planning framework, ensuring that major applications in the Greenbelt are treated like site allocations in a local plan. Indeed, that I think they should be required to go through the plan making process, a process the government is saying is going to be speeded up. Housing targets must be adjusted to reflect national policy to keep Greenbelts permanently open. The situation that Three Rivers find themselves in at the moment is a complete contradiction. And critically, there needs to be an effective mechanism for cross-border spatial planning, sub-regional at least. And through all this, we need honesty from government about how the vision we hope for the Greenbelt can be realised on the ground. Warm theoretical words are not enough.
We seem to have lost Jerry there. I can carry on if people are happy to.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I will try and carry on. I think Jerry's made the point on that one. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, right. Okay. Well, that's good timing for losing Jerry, isn't it? But I echo what he's just said. Sorry, just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Stuart Pomeroy. I'm the managing agent for the Colne Valley Park. I think we are grateful for the foresight of our predecessors in the 60s who set up the Colne Valley Regional Park. We, as Jerry has said, have produced a green infrastructure strategy working with our friends in the Colne Valley. To implement this for the Colne Valley Park, we need the support from national and local government to ensure that this attractive green space for the benefit of 3 million people who live within 10 miles can survive and flourish for future generations. And I think I'll close with just saying, you know, now is the time that we need to work on all of that. If we don't do this, and we don't do this now, and we, I mean all of us collectively, national, local government, organisations like ourselves working at the local level, then what will the Colne Valley Park look like in 20 years' time? I'll close on that note. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jerry and Stuart, for illuminating so clearly the challenges of looking after the Greenbelt at the local level. We've had some good questions rolling in while the presentations have been happening, and we're going to sort of attempt to answer them all, but do keep them coming if you've got further thoughts or comments. So the first question is for David. We had a question about whether we shouldn't just be declaring a climate change emergency, whether it should be a climate change and a nature emergency, to sort of really look at how we can deliver biodiversity net gain.
So just in response to that, you know, it's difficult to separate them out. You know, I appreciate that in terms of the climate change is looking at emissions. However, in terms of if you look at this holistic, many of the solutions are nature-based. So I think, you know, you have to look at the two together. So for me, you know, that they are interrelated. I think, you know, any climate change strategy would need to incorporate nature-based solutions in there, which is part of the thinking about local nature recovery strategies. How do you build in that thinking in terms of carbon management, biodiversity net gain, you know, ecosystems and healthy ecosystems are the basis of our ability to kind of survive and thrive. So, you know, that they are absolutely interlinked.
Great, thank you. And linked to that, we had another question, David, about how to actually monitor biodiversity net gain and ensure that, you know, what developers sort of promise in their applications is actually delivered on the ground.
So once the Environment Bill, I suppose, is law, local authorities will have 2 years to prepare to actually deliver local schemes. Now, some authorities will be ready earlier than others. You know, all I would say is that, you know, the government are very well aware that you need to have trained ecologists based at local authorities to be able to assess, evaluate the data that's kind of coming in with applications. You know, at the moment, a lot of authorities don't have that capacity, and that's been pointed out, is that, you know, if you're going to have a successful implementation of net gain, you're going to need those trained ecologists to be able to evaluate the information that's kind of coming in, advise the planning officers, and obviously then kind of being able to kind of monitor post that. So, you know, that's fundamental to it being a success, is to have that, I suppose, intelligence in local authority ecologists to be able to evaluate that.
Sorry, Catriona, the next question is for you. How can we use the planning system to build multifunctional use of greenbelt and to stem the loss of land for food production?
Start with an easy one then.
I know, a big question.
Yeah, big question. To me, it does get back to sort of that strategic approach, and I think, you know, the London plan has already, you know, tried to sort of introduce that multifunctional approach and have got away with it, you know, so there's no reason why we can't do that through sort of local plans. But, you know, and it's linked to that issue around how do you determine your exceptional circumstances, and the word I will use is vision. Everything you do in a local plan, not one policy stands on its own. It has to be seen within that wider approach to your placemaking vision and your objectives. You know, what are you trying to do in your area for the next 10, 15 years? How are you going to change it? And what policies do you need to make that work? You know, so how do you determine whether there are exceptional circumstances to release greenbelt? Well, you have to take into account what your priorities are. What is it that you're trying to do? So that could be as simple, I think, in the case of Guildford, in that High Court challenge, they decided that their housing needs were overwhelming and they had no other way of meeting it, and they took the decision that that was pretty much sufficient to pass the test of exceptional circumstances. But it could be that more directly affordable housing is your priority, and the conclusion is that you know, you're going to lose more by losing greenbelt sites than you're going to gain in terms of affordable housing. But it must be tied back to these wider issues that you mentioned. You know, so it is about the issues around overarching objectives around climate change. It's around health and well-being, how you support active travel, and also that really fundamental issue of what is metropolitan greenbelt. You know, its fundamental role is to separate London from other parts, and how do you tackle that through your exceptional circumstances sort of cost benefit analysis. So all these issues around food production and things like that, you know, they all come up in terms of any approach to land management, and your land management strategy and everything else should layer on to your sort of local plan, as does your you know, your local transport plan and everything else. But in order to have that integrated approach, I'm afraid to say you need a better approach to strategic planning. So in Surrey, we've got the Surrey Place ambition, where we are trying to do just that. We're trying to overlay local plans with land management, with the overarching approach to the economic strategy, the local transport plan, climate change, health and wellbeing. So we're trying very much to overlay all these different things to give us a good approach to strategic planning and how we use land in every different way. But the system just doesn't support that at a statutory level at the moment, unfortunately, with local plans. And that issue David raised around, you know, what weight will these new plans have in terms of local planning? These, back to my point, you need an integrated approach at government. You need a cross-departmental approach to this, or we're not going to get anywhere.
Great. Thank you. We've had some sort of more detailed questions at the sort of neighbourhood planning level, sort of directed at David. How do you think neighbourhood plan policies can help local authorities prepare local nature recovery strategies? And sort of linked to that, will the pilot mapping outputs be available to the groups?
So I'd like to think it would work both ways. So, you know, as part of that exercise in terms of that understanding the baseline data, you know, I think what we're asked to do as part of that guidance is to understand what exists out there in terms of, you know, existing priorities, plans. So that's part of the exercise you have to go through at the start of the process, which would include kind of neighbourhood plans. But I'd like to kind of think that, you know, once you've gone through a process of, you know, creating a document together with the kind of your local stakeholders, it's there to help inform those as well, kind of going ahead. So it feels as though it's a two-way process. So at the moment, you know, our mapping outputs in terms of the kind of our prototype, it's been a submission to DEFRA in terms of learning exercise. So they've not been kind of published yet. A lot of the baseline data has, so I think, you know, that's freely available. But, you know, when we do the I suppose the real thing, well, yeah, absolutely, in terms of that will be available. But yeah, we can circulate a lot of the baseline data, which I kind of referred to earlier on. That's kind of available now. We can happily circulate that around.
Great, thanks, David. Catriona, we had a specific question about how you do a cost-benefit analysis for Greenbelt release, and is there any guidance or methodology available?
No, there isn't any guidance or sort of available in the sort of the national planning guidance, but cost-benefit analysis is back to the point I was making earlier. It should be linked directly to what your objectives are in your local plan. You know, you should be able to look at whether you need Greenbelt release based on what you will achieve out of it and what the costs of that are going to be. And it is an interesting one in terms of what the NPPF says, because it doesn't say that you have to meet your needs in some of these areas. It says you should do your best to meet your needs. But if the costs of releasing Greenbelt, for example, outweigh some of the national priorities, then, you know, there is nothing that says you have to meet your full needs in the standard methodology. And I think that's where we've gone slightly wrong. But it is down to the local authority to decide what factors they take into account in that cost benefit analysis. It is exceptional in that sense. And it is down to the local planning authority to decide what weight they give to the different factors in that cost benefit analysis. But for me, that needs to be linked back to your vision and objectives, what you're trying to do through your sort of placemaking activity in the first place. What is it your local plan is going to deliver, and how will that cost benefit analysis fit within that wider sort of approach, that strategy and vision you're trying to deliver?
Great. I think that's sort of very much linked to the sort of next question for Jerry is, and how do you propose to tackle the decoupling of regional economic and environmental planning policy? So, for example, where the value of ecosystem services, agricultural, land management, voluntary community services get properly taken into account and integrated into holistic planning.
Thank you, Katya. I think that those aspects you outlined, the ecosystem, agricultural land management into a holistic approach, reflects exactly what the Colne Valley Regional Park is about. So certainly when the park makes its representations on plans and proposals, it does that in the light of what our objectives are. So my answer would be we press for it, but unfortunately the regional park has no executive sort of powers to direct that these things happen. So at the moment, with each authority preparing its own plan and no strategic overview plan, it is down to those authorities to, take into account our comments and comments of others. So support very much the sort of the whole concept that's been put forward there, but it's not for us to implement, it's for the local authorities.
Okay. And linked to that, there's sort of been some questions around how you can enhance the protection of the Colne Valley Regional Park and how to go about doing that.
Well, that's what one of the things that lay behind getting the green infrastructure strategy in place in 2019. And so what we're very keen is that as I said in my presentation, that's a baton that's been thrown down, and we really hope that the local authorities pick that up and interpret it. And rather like David was saying about the nature recovery strategies and the other evidence that should inform local plans, we want that strategy to be developed and taken on another stage by the local authorities. It would be much better if it's in concert, together as a wider strategy, but nevertheless picked up by each authority, put into an evidence base, and that then informs the local plan. And I think the key thing, which goes back to what Catriona was saying about the objectives and vision of each authority in their plan, if they have got a vision that shows that the Colne Valley Regional Park right on the edge of London should be a protected area, improved, not just a backdrop for various development proposals, then that can inform the whole nature of their strategy, their implementation. So that's the sequence that we see, but it's got to be picked up by the local authorities. And I mentioned in my presentation about frustration about individual applications. Some of these individual applications outside of the plan making process are huge. They are strategic proposals, and we've got some of them around Ivor Heath at the moment, and that those need to be thought of in the same way. We can't just treat them in a little bubble, because it's about knitting together the landscape and making it better for people to use, access, green corridors, and we've got to think strategic. It's not an ordinary planning application. That's how I feel about it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stuart, the next question's for you. There was noted that there's been a proposal to consider extending the Chilterns AONB and for that to cover part of the regional park. What do you think about this proposal?
Yeah, thank you. The character of the north of the Colne Valley Park, including across the parts of Hillingdon, is very similar in landscape character to the Chilterns. I think the point to be made is that the Colne Valley serves as a gateway to the Chilterns for Londoners, but also, and very importantly, as a buffer to the Chilterns. If the Colne Valley were to vanish, which some of Jerry's maps show you that might happen, then all this rural urban fringe issues that we're experiencing are going to go right up to the edge of the AONB. We've had discussions with the Chilterns AONB in the past about the boundary review, and we've recently contacted to reopen those discussions. I do know that at least one of our local MPs is making a similar point about the boundary review for the AONB, looking at the Colne Valley Park, as are some local councillors. So we're happy to continue those conversations to keep those things going. The key point to make is that the Colne Valley Park really needs the status, powers and resources to enable it to act as the champion for the countryside. Linking up with the Chilterns AONB stroke National Park is just one way this could happen, but there are others. Local authorities can do it. They can coordinate better across administrative boundaries and have stronger policies that link up to each other. We can look to national government for looking at the Colne Valley in its own light as a resource for countryside on the west of London. So there's lots of lots of opportunity to be taken, but like I said earlier, we need to get those conversations going fast now.
Great. David, next question for you. There was a question about how you integrate the sort of environmental policies within the planning system and how they're given appropriate weight at planning committees. And is there a risk of danger of just playing lip service to these ideas? And for the last part of the question, you might need a crystal ball because they'd like to know when the NPPF will adopt these measures.
So as we've kind of gone through the kind of the pilot process in terms of local net recovery strategies, we've had a bit of an insight into kind of almost government thinking, which has been really helpful. So I think if in terms of reassurance, that dialogue that's going on between DEFRA and MHCLG, so on the one hand the department that's bringing forward all these big environmental policies, and on the other hand the kind of the planning, there is a dialogue. These are the two key kind of government policies, and there is that kind of willingness to understand, I think, how these kind of key environmental objectives are embedded, incorporated into kind of the planning system. So I think if there's kind of some reassurance, we know that dialogue is going on, and Catriona mentioned the need for that in terms of that kind of joined up of policy thinking, because you're right, these do need to have sufficient weight in terms of that they're kind of taken on board with. Yes, it's an evidence base, but what's the kind of the weight? And I think we're expecting that kind of guidance, certainly the guidance in respect to local net recovery strategies, probably late summer, early autumn, and authorities will be required to start producing these, assuming the bill gets royal assent, from spring of next year. So they'll need to start on the process from spring of next year, but certainly the guidance, the detailed guidance, we're expecting late kind of autumn, late summer, early autumn. But yeah, so I think just an assurance that we know those discussions are going on behind the scenes to make sure there's that join up going on.
Great. And next question is also for you, David. Was talking about where local habitat maps are really helpful, but what about if you don't have that mapping and you're relying on desktop studies? Is there a danger that species of interest will be overlooked or developers get off lightly because there isn't the evidence base to support?
So I think in terms of the work we've done on the local net recovery strategies, so all the evidence base we've got, and admittedly there will be gaps. One of the feedback from the pilots is, we probably know the extent and of kind of habitat, so that you should have a pretty good idea. What is less clear is conditions of those habitats. That's been a feedback from all the pilots, is that they all lack the condition of these habitats, and I think that's a big omission, and quite how DEFRA address that in terms of going ahead. But I think in terms of do we have an idea of overall in terms of where the habitats are, the extent? I think we do. There's a whole variety of data sets that we've pulled together, both national data sets, but local data sets that, for instance, our local environmental record centres hold. There's a real good evidence base that we've got together to inform local net recovery strategies, but certainly condition of those habitats was an issue, and I think that's one thing we have fed back, how they go about updating that, because you're going to need that to monitor progress on these.
Great, thank you. Changing tack slightly, I've got a question for Catriona. Does Metropolitan Open Land have the same power as Greenbelt?
I guess the answer is no, but it is getting more like Greenbelt, because the thing that distinguished Greenbelt before was its permanence and the fact that it should remain, pretty much intact unless, again, there are exceptional circumstances, a real need to review it. And Metropolitan Open Land still has a very high status, and I think some would argue equal status, but that sort of permanence issue I don't think it's applied in the same way. But Greenbelt doesn't have that permanence anymore either, so they're probably more similar than they should be than nowadays. And I think one of the issues for local plans is, if you're reviewing a local plan every 5 years, and it gets back to that sort of hope value, how on earth do you improve open land, if it's greenbelt, you know, if you've got a scrappy bit of greenbelt that's not very accessible, you know, how do you make it more accessible? How do you improve its overall quality so you do get that sort of multi-benefits, whether it's metropolitan open land or greenbelt? And one of the issues there is the permanence used to allow you to do that because there was less hope value. But now, because we've got local plan reviews every 5 years, and there is an assumption that everything gets thrown up in the air every 5 years, and therefore that means greenbelt is vulnerable every 5 years, that hope value is much higher, whether it's metropolitan greenbelt or metropolitan open space or greenbelt. So we need to get to a place where there is probably not that much distinction, but both are valued in terms of their permanence, and there is an assumption that every time you review a local plan, you don't necessarily review that bit of it. And it gets back to that overall strategy and vision. You know, it's the tools to deliver it that should change, not necessarily the overall strategy and vision that should change every 5 years. And that is how we used to do it. But now it's the assumption is that we start with almost with a blank sheet of paper every 5 years, which is not how long-term place shaping should play out.
Great. There's been sort of one interesting comment in response to your answer there, suggesting that metropolitan land is stronger than greenbelt because it cannot be released without the consent of the Mayor of London, whereas greenbelt can be released on the decision simply of that of the local authority. Which is
that's fair enough. It comes down to, like all of these, it comes down to the decision maker. Doesn't make it stronger probably. It just means that it's harder to get it released.
Great. Catriona, the next question is for you, and it's kind of a big one again, is how do we persuade the government to stop planning by numbers?
Yeah, it's a shame that I even heard the planning minister talk about, you know, housing strategies or housing plans as opposed to local plans. It is it's a huge issue, and a whole generation of planners now since 2012, that's all they've known. And I think that's the real shame in terms of the profession, is that, you know, we've got planners that are looking for housing sites as opposed to developing long-term place shaping strategies. And I guess playing devil's advocate is that the NPPF as is written now allows us to do good placemaking and deliver local plans that are not just about numbers, but it's all in the application, because anytime planners toddle up to government and sit with civil servants tell them they have to meet the housing needs, they have to meet the standard methodology, and that isn't what the NPPF says. So I'm hoping that we'll get a little bit of a pushback now, and that we actually really start doing proper placemaking local plans and strategies, which the NPPF allows, and less focus on housing numbers. But you know, it will need a few brave councils to do that, to start testing the water on that, and I hope that, given that we're going to have a lot of local planning authorities around the edge of London coming forward with their local plans now, I'm hoping there's at least some of them willing to take that sort of brave decision and on behalf of the rest, and challenge it a little bit.
Excellent. We've had some sort of related questions to that. Sort of various attendees have cited examples of proposed developments or potential release within the Greenbelt, and asking how to balance the ideology of the Greenbelt and the desire to enhance those spaces and the pressures to develop, given the sort of financial benefits. Jerry, perhaps you'd like to have a first go at that question.
Well, I think it goes back to having a strategy that is, as Catriona says, not only about meeting housing needs, but is also about improving your natural environment and how it connects up, and that is a key part, I would say, of your evidence base, and about bringing to life the green belt in the ways that it should be. And I'm not an expert on what every authority has done, but I do remember when Windsor and Maidenhead went to their local plan examination, they had a green infrastructure strategy. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it was a green infrastructure strategy that set a tone, and I think that is critical for every authority to do the same, because then, yeah, it's a question of, do you believe in that, or are you just, as Catriona has said, are you just about trying to tick the boxes of meeting the development needs? But over and above this, and I think it's what the government is probably concerned about, is if one authority doesn't meet its needs and doesn't pass it on to its neighbouring authority under duty to cooperate, or whatever the replacement will be, then the net effect is we don't meet our needs. But what that goes back to is the need for strategic planning, and this needs being met in sensible locations. And I think, yeah, we are at a really important stage of reform of the planning system, and I just hope the government get it.
Okay. And our final question, which I think is for Catriona, is to do with exceptional circumstances and how we achieve consistency with 66 different local planning authorities, all with different views on what that means.
Well, I'll finish where Jerry left off. It's impossible to do that unless you have a strategic context, back to whether it was done at a regional level or sort of at the county level. There needs to be a way of testing different spatial options and setting the sort of general extent of the green belt that then says, in order to deliver our growth strategy, we need to release green belt here, here and here, but not anywhere else. And, unless you've got that, you're going to have a whole load of different approaches to exceptional circumstances, but it does, under the current system, it is down to individual local planning authorities to set the context of their exceptional circumstances, as I said, through that sort of cost-benefit analysis. And again, I'll repeat that the only way you can do that is if you have a really strong vision for your area as a place and how it's going to grow and how it's going to respond to some of these really big challenges around climate change and improving health and well-being, as well as meeting housing needs. If you've got that, then you'll be able to sort of set your exceptional circumstances through that cost-benefit analysis, and others may learn from that. But every local planning authority under the current system is unique. Everyone will have to set their own exceptional circumstances, and some, like Guildford, will decide that there are exceptional circumstances because of the housing need. Others will decide that there are other factors that are more important than meeting their needs in full. So that's the way we are at the moment, unless there is something around the strategic planning side coming through the planning reforms to address really critical issues like this.
Great. Thank you very much to the panel for answering these questions. Apologies to those who we didn't answer, and we will try to answer those in the materials circulated after the presentation. And it's over to Lord Randall now for the closing remarks.
Right, well, thank you all very much indeed. There's a lot to digest there, but very, very informative. And I would just say, actually, I got into politics slightly unwillingly, but over actually fighting a threat to Greenbelt locally. So it's very much something I care about. And locally, where I am here, just on the edge of Uxbridge, the Colne Valley has a place like Little Britain Lake, where I go bird watching and walking. Have been absolutely vital to me during lockdown. And I have to say also, I just get so depressed when I see the HS2 construction compounds, which are like a small town. But not everything is dismal. But what I do say is that with all these things, everybody's got to work together and also work before the plans are finally made. I think it was David who said that, but it's absolutely true. And I used to remember as an MP, when people used to come to me about planning applications, it was almost when the buildings were going up, they're saying, can't you do something about it? And you'd say, well, didn't you object when you saw them? And the answer is, well, I didn't think it was important. So we do have to keep ahead of everything. So there are plenty of reasons to keep going. You mentioned the Environment Bill. I'm living and dreaming that at the moment, and there are various things going on with that. We mentioned biodiversity net gain for major infrastructure projects, although we've got that coming up on tomorrow, in fact. But we've got to just check what that's all about. The planning bill is obviously another big thing. And there is going to be a natural friction between departments, in the same way as there's a friction between local authorities almost cross-border, and that's what we have got to work together. So I'd just like to thank everybody for their attendance and their input. The recording of the event and answers to questions raised, as far as we're able, will be shared afterwards. And I believe they are asking for feedback using a pro forma issued. So I'd really just like to thank the speakers and the panel. That's David, Katrina, and Jerry. And I'd just like to say we in the Colne Valley are willing to work with national government, local authorities and any others to find the means to achieve high quality functional green belt. For wildlife, people, countryside, recreation, farming and all the other purposes that our predecessors in the 20th century had the foresight to establish the green belt for, and then establish the Colne Valley Regional Park. So thank you all once again, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.